Chapter 1. The Hour Hand. It was the sort of waking that felt less like rising to the surface of sleep than like being lifted into a different liquid entirely, a cool medium with no current and no depth. And as Detective Elin Hart sat up with a stiffness she could not blame entirely on age or on last week's stakeout, and the coins of sleep that had been paid in a running car, she realized that what she had mistaken for darkness was not darkness at all but a pale, immaculate absence, the color of unprinted paper and dusted chalk, a room that had never learned what a window was and did not appear to miss the lesson. The light came from nowhere and everywhere. It was not the brightness of a bulb or the moral fluorescence of a hospital ceiling, but an even illumination that made edges honest and surfaces mute, so that the steel table along one wall, and the narrow bed on which she'd been arranged, and the painted concrete floor with its faint hairline cracks all presented themselves with the same calm, indifferent clarity, as if to explain that this was a place where objects behaved and people would eventually learn to. She catalogued with the automatic patience the job had taught her starting in the days when patience was cheaper and coffee better. For walls, poured and smooth, a door without handle or hinges, flushed to the jamb like a secret that had made a decision, a vent high up that exhaled an air neither cold nor warm, scented faintly with the antiseptic sweetness of an emptied clinic and something older underneath. Old books, old raincoats hung wet in a squad room, the bronze penny smell of long dried blood in hallways where cleaners had an understanding with memory, a clock, which at first she had thought a smear of darker paint, mounted above the door where a window might have been if the room had permitted one, its dial unnumbered, and its hands too slender for factory issue, a minute hand that crept without stutter, and an hour hand that might have been a rumor. Her body did a roll call, tongue thick but uninjured, wrists free, pockets empty, her belt gone, her boots laced, her shoulder holster, an absence she felt like phantom weight, a bruise at her hairline, the polite size of a thumb, not the kind you earn in a fight, but the kind you get from a low shelf when you bend where you shouldn't. She said her name under her breath because names can be leashes when panic begins to nose around your knees, and she let the syllables sit on the taste of the air until they became plausible. When she stood, the room did not tilt, and when she crossed to the door her hand extended toward a handle that was not there, a movement as involuntary as reaching for a light in a childhood house years after the switch had been moved, and her palm met a seam as fine as a paper cut, and the door remained the architectural equivalent of a polite smile that does not invite conversation. On the table a single object lay, which she had not seen a moment before, and which must have been there all along and also could not have been, and Ellen, who had spent 20 years in rooms that liked to show her the same trick until she learned the unhandsome pleasure of pretending to be surprised, went very still because there are ways to look at certain things that make them worse, and she did not want to encourage the room to become theatrical. It was a clear evidence bag, the good kind, with the red tamper strip and the printed lines for case number and date and collector, and inside the bag a child's sneaker sat with the weary dignity of an object that has worked for a living, canvas the color of cherry lifesavers, laces gray with sidewalk, toe scuffed, sole worn into the shallow smile all city shoes learn. On the bag, the lines had been filled in with a hand she knew without needing to read, the neat block capitals of a patrolman who had died 10 years ago in a bar that forgot to install a camera, a man who had shown her once how to tape a perimeter so that pedestrians felt inconvenienced but not ordered, whose pencil had always been sharp and who believed the world could be tidied into boxes if you kept the paper fresh. Beneath his handwriting was hers, Detective E. Hart, written in the tired swagger she allowed herself at 3 in the morning when the scene was ugly and the uniforms needed a handwriting that looked like it knew what to do next. The clock above the door made a small decision and let the minute hand cross the threshold between strict and done. A noise came with it, a single soft chime, not bell and not electricity, the quiet punctuation of a watch tapped on a desk, and the hair on her forearms lifted as if the air had brushed past her on its way to someone with better manners. She did not touch the bag yet. You never touch the first thing a room offers you until you know how it likes to be thanked. She looked for cameras and found none, looked for seams and found only architecture, looked for the part of herself that was more frightened than curious, and found that it had not been given the same invitation she had, at least not yet. The evidence seal had been signed. The signature belonged to a younger Elin, the woman who had stood in a rain that smelled like hot metal outside in elementary school, where 3 children had vanished from a playground while their teacher counted aloud to 20 and looked back to see that 20 had never included them. The day of red tape and lunchboxes, and a mother whose mouth kept trying to make a name and kept finding instead a sound no one had prepared the language for. She swallowed, and the room accepted the sound as if it were poetry, and she picked up the bag with the care any cop learns even if the television shows never learned to film that kind of care, and the weight of the sneaker was wrong for the girl who had worn it. The sole was too heavy, as if it had been walked in by someone with a different idea of gravity, and the canvas gave off a smell that was not playground and not kitchen tile, but the mineral odor of a damp basement where a dehumidifier had been unplugged 3 days ago, and a mildew had found its first sentence. On the bag, written in narrower ink underneath the block-printed lines, a notation had been added that did not exist last time she had seen this item in any locker. Room without windows, hour 1. Ellen's mouth did the movement it made when a suspect said something both true and insufficient. Her tongue touched the back of her teeth, as if a word had knocked politely and been told to return at a better time. She waited to see what the room would do with the quiet, and the room did what rooms do when they are certain of their schedule. It breathed, which is to say the vent changed its rhythm by half a beat, and the clock advanced a minute with the solemnity of a priest who has learned that ceremony is what people call it when they are afraid of math. She placed the bag on the table where the table had made space for it, because all tables in such rooms have been taught by decades of procedure to expect the arrival of certain tidied tragedies, and she walked the perimeter with her palm grazing the wall as if it were a dog learning to heel, and at each corner the paint changed by a fraction of a shade, so that if she squinted, she could imagine it had been touched and retouched, primed and sealed, as if the room were a palimpsest that erased, only to make room for another writing. When the clock decided to be an hour older, she knew it in her bones before she heard it. There is a place in the sternum that keeps its own minutes, and hers ticked into a new count, and then the chime came again, and with it a sound from the table, like the careful arrival of a tray in a passenger car, a soft, reasonable slide, and a drawer she had not seen in the table's flank presented itself politely and stopped flush with her thigh. And on the drawer a second bag waited without smugness. Because evidence does not preen, it only exists. Inside the bag, a cassette tape sat, the kind whose Band-Aid color had been the official shade of truth for a certain decade. 2 holes like eyes, the label written in the same younger hand of hers that had signed the sneaker's seal. Interview, Mother/Maria Lozano, December 12th. She remembered the interview because there are certain recordings no one who has heard them forgets. A radiator's hiss under every word. The way grief made the mother's consonants sound like they had been wrapped in cloth. The way Ellen's own voice had been too even because she had not yet learned that sometimes you have to let your questions show their knees. There was a tape player in the drawer as well, institutional and sturdier than its price suggested, and for an instant the room was an interrogation suite, and for an instant it was her car, and for an instant it was the precinct they had closed and turned into a daycare, and she pressed play because the hour had asked her to, and because it is cruel to keep certain voices mute when the room has decided to accommodate them. The hiss arrived like weather. The mother's breath came next, then Ellen's question, and in the second between question and answer, with the room listening and the light not brightening and not dimming but adjusting its attention the way a cat does when something has become interesting, she felt the cold inch down from the vent, not to punish her, not to make a show, but to remind the living that air passes through us uninterested in our schedules. Did she take anything with her? Her younger voice asked, and Maria Lozano, who had at that point been in the world 15 years longer than her daughter, and would go on to be in it twice as long without her, said, "She took the red ones because you bought them," and the tape motor whirred, and the sentence laid itself down on the paint, and now the sneaker on the table took on the weight of an apology Ellen could neither offer nor accept. She let the tape run, and when it gave up the drawer sighed as if satisfied with its own mechanism and slid home. The clock prepared another chime. The room remained a room, which is to say it remained a proposition and a threat and a habit, and she allowed herself to sit on the bed, and she allowed her hand to tremble once, briefly, without ceremony. The second hour had brought a voice. The third hour would bring a different form of speech, and Ellen, who had outlived partners and precincts and a marriage that died not of violence, but of the gravity that pulls good people in different orbits, understood that the room was not merely showing her objects, but was building a syntax, and that if she learned its grammar quickly enough, she might persuade it to conjugate a door. Chapter 2. The Ledger and the Coin. The chime that announced hour 3 carried, beneath its gentle courtesy, a darker resonance. Not a threat exactly, but a suggestion that the instrument had been tuned elsewhere and now remembered the hand that tuned it. Elin stood before the table with her palm on the steel because the human body teaches itself to speak to metals and extremity, and when the drawer delivered the third offering, it did so with the same modest economy. A miniature slide, an insistence on neatness that reminded her uncomfortably of the morgue tech who whistled while rearranging hands into attitudes more forgiving for the bereaved. This time it was a photograph in an evidence sleeve, not glossy but matte, the kind printed on paper that liked to keep its ink, and when she lifted it, it gave that frail whisper only old paper knows, and she saw herself first, because that is how the mind behaves when forced to look at a document of its own past. There she was, younger and sharper, her hair still committed to a part, standing on the Lozano stoop with a legal pad held like a buckler, and to her left her partner at the time, Joel Madsen, his smile resting at the corner of his mouth the way some men keep their cigarette smoke there, and near the bottom edge, Elin felt the tremor before she saw it. Near the frame where memory had not granted permission to be included, a reflection caught in the brass plate of the door, round and shallow, a distorted little room with a man's shoulders just visible and a lens like an unblinking eye. She turned the photograph over not because she believed the back could be more generous, but because habit has its privileges, and someone had written a number there, not a file number, but a clock time, 3 o'clock, and below it in the cramped, tidy hand of the property clerk who had taught her patience by insisting on repeating every accession rule in full as if reciting a catechism, unassigned photographer/source unknown. She did what she always did when a piece of evidence became inexplicable by ordinary means. She let the panic arrive as a polite guest and then asked it to fetch her something from the kitchen, and while it was gone, she worked the edges. Who had the negative? Where had it been stored? How had it left? Why was she seeing it now? The room listened, not with malice, not as entertainment, but with the simple attentive hunger of a ledger that has discovered it can count sound. And Elin found herself speaking aloud, careful, slow, long sentences whose only purpose was to keep her mouth moving and therefore prevent it from training itself to shape the wrong syllables later. She said that rooms sometimes present mirrors at angles, that reflection is a kind of evidence unreliable as witnesses and useful as sin, that the third hour was too early for supernatural conclusions and too late for ordinary happiness. She put the photograph down with the caution of a person handling a sleeping insect and did not let herself look again at the brass plate with its tiny, unintended portrait because she did not want to teach the room that she could be bullied by her own face. The air grew a degree cooler not because the room meant harm, but because rooms cannot forgive the human desire to assign motive to machines. It is our vanity and also our art. The clock's minute hand gave up another 60 little arcs. The hour hand moved in its patience. The chime came again. The drawer gave its reluctant gift, and this time the room had decided to stop being shy. An envelope thick enough to demand a coat lay there with a rubber band around it the color of dried apricot, and inside the envelope a sheaf of photocopies that had inherited the dirt of the original pages in the pale, fumy way of old office ink, and at the very top the first of the ledger sheets from the evidence room, the daily log, lines filled in with the care that had once passed for authority. Evidence removed. Chain of custody followed by the dates that had lived so long in her head they no longer felt like numbers, but like seasons. The winter of the red sneaker, the spring of the cassette, the summer in which the file had been moved to cold cases, and a new label affixed by a clerk who had spent a year treating Elin like a widow treats the house after a funeral, as if every drawer could betray her. Her own name appeared 3 times on the log, a 4th when you counted the copy they had made for the task force, and on the last line there was a signature she did not at first recognize and then recognized with a cold that made her knees feel like paper, because it belonged not to any of the detectives who had worked the Lozano case, and not to a prosecutor, and not to a judge, and not even to Madsen. who had died of a heart that had done too good a job and then, perversely, refused to do it at all, but to a man named Riley, who had sat 3 desks down and had the habit of eating apples in a manner suggestive of sex because he believed it made him interesting, and who had once volunteered to return a piece of evidence to the locker when Elin had been called to a domestic that needed a quiet voice and a woman's bathroom. She had thanked him with automatic politeness and then forgotten the courtesy, the way you forget dust until you write across a table with your finger and the message. Shows up plain as sin. There was a coin washed to paleness tucked in the envelope's bottom fold. It was not currency exactly. It had the size of a quarter and the weight of a button, and the face of a woman who looked like justice if justice had given up cigarettes and learned to smile without humor, and around the edge a motto in Latin Elin did not need high school to translate. Lex optima medicina. The law as medicine. A piety cop's employ when the ambulance is late. She turned the coin in her fingers, and the metal carried a temperature it should not have had, a faint warmth like a pocket that had just been emptied. She recognized it because she had worn its twin for a year when she had been seconded to the task force that had pretended to be federal and had practiced being local instead. And when that year had ended, and the case had ended not at all, she had given the coin back with the relieved rage of a woman returning a dress that had not fit. The room produced no new object in that 3rd hour because it had already given more than a room should, but it adjusted a peripheral detail with low cruelty. The vent's exhalation synced itself to the clock so that every 60 seconds a faint new breath arrived, out of phase from Ellen's own, and she found herself trying not to match it because there are ways in which a room can teach you to breathe for it, and she had not brought a replacement. She drank the air anyway. She put the envelope down. She let herself stand with her back to the wall, not because the wall could be trusted, but because it gave her spine something to argue with, and she told herself again, as she had told herself on nights when the rain had made the city's shame visible esteem, that all rooms are interrogation rooms if you wait long enough, and that she would not be charged for talking until she stopped choosing her verbs. Hour 4 arrived with the modesty of a surgeon taking off his gloves, which is to say almost imperceptibly and with an authority that remained polite. The drawer did not slide. The table did not theatrically present. Instead, a light in the far corner came up that had not existed a second before, a light like a little square of dawn pasted onto the wall, and within that light a shelf revealed itself, as if blooming from concrete. And upon the shelf lay the thing Elin had both expected and most feared, which is to say a plastic biohazard sleeve the color of hospital naps, and inside it a single .38 round squashed into a crescent where it had met bone, and then floor, a fleck of copper at the crease catching the room's attention like a tiny stained glass window, and along the margin somebody had written again in that same precise clerkly hand a time and a place, and 2 initials that it hurt to see together. Jan. So that for a moment the room seemed to hold both Joel Madsen as a man who had taught Elin how to look under sinks for the whiskey the husband had hidden and under beds for the child who had learned to hide, and Joel Madsen as a case, which is what police become when they fail to be the first thing. She knew without being told that the bullet had come from a weapon whose serial number the room could recite, and that the chain of custody would be clean up until the day the evidence officer named Riley had signed and had not returned the entry, which is to say the chain would be a chain until it preferred to be a ribbon, and that somewhere an absence had been notarized and filed, and that now the absence had found her. And she did not lift the sleeve because the room had made it clear it did. Not like being rushed. She stood before it as she had stood before the shrine the Lozanos had maintained on their many windowsills, candles in jars, saints with the names of flowers, and she let the seconds by the clock fall like small coins she was paying for an hour she did not want. The absence of time can be as noisy as a train. Here time was obedient. Perhaps that was worse. When the 5th hour came, she was ready to admit that the room did not intend to be satisfied with making her a curated witness to her own failures. It wanted a confession and had not yet decided which era's law it would accept as valid. Hour 5 brought a ledger she had never seen, a phone log torn from a spiral pad with ragged teeth, the dated lines matching evenings when she had been on call, and the neat notation of a number she knew by muscle memory because she had dialed it with cold fingers in the rain. Joel's house, answered by his wife with the careful fatigue of the woman who becomes secretary to a precinct because the precinct calls at dinner. The final line of the log, circled once, was a call placed from a payphone near the river, time-stamped 9 minutes after Elin had left the station the night before the Lozano case had gone from missing to presumed, and the number had connected to a voicemail with the clerk's voice. "Property, leave your badge, and I'll leave the truth." And she felt the room waiting for the moment when her face would break the way a face breaks when a lifetime's worth of coincidence receives a new adjective. The chime came, and she heard in it an inflection that had not existed in the first hours, a harmonic like a heartbeat learned by a borrowed instrument, and it moved across her skin the way the blur of a passing car moves across your face when you realize it has no lights. She understood then that the room had been holding the next object back until she had permitted herself a name for what it was trying to be, and that only now was it willing to deposit on the table a small cloth-covered book. She recognized in the first fraction of a second as the kind of ledger no city buys in bulk anymore, the kind with a spine that admired itself and paper thick enough to allow regret to bleed without becoming theatrical. It was blank. It weighed as if it had not been. When she opened it, the first page had been filled without ink, the letters depressed into the paper without leaving pigment, and she read her own handwriting in ghost relief. "The room without windows, Elin Hart," statement taken hourly, and after that a series of times and the beginnings of a narrative she had not written yet and would write anyway if the room had its way. She closed the book and the pressure of her fingers left half-lunar marks on the cover. The material warmed the way things warm when they have been made to serve. She set it down as if it were a sleeping mouth. The clock's hands continued their indifferent revolution. The sneaker sat. The tape player waited. The bullet glimmered in its faint, obscene crescent. The photograph stared with its unintended eye. The coin from the task force lay between envelopes like a witness about to remember a crucial detail feigned forgotten for years. Elin sat, and when she sat she laughed once, which was not forgiveness and not surrender, but the sort of laughter a person allows herself when the world reveals that it has read her diary out of order and nevertheless claims understanding. She put her palms on her knees. She looked at the door without handle and disliked it less, because now it was not pretending to be a door at all. It was a wall, and she could plan for walls. "Hour by hour," she said, and even as she spoke the room replied with its breath, and her words laid themselves down on the ledger's first page without ink. And if any law had jurisdiction here, it was the old one that says whatever you reach for in the dark owns your hand until you make a better offer. Chapter 3. The Body You Owe. Hunger arrived with the patience of a clerk, the sort that pinches paper from the edges to avoid smudging the evidence, and with it a thirst that belonged less to the mouth than to the mind, a dry scrape at the place where questions join, and Elin, who had interrogated men into confessing thirsts they didn't know the names for, recognized the tactic and refused to grant it a clear desk. She stood and paced the boundaries as if drawing chalk around the shape of the room's idea of her might produce a perimeter the door understood. The scuffs on the concrete resolved themselves into geographies, a small whirl near the bed like a storm scene from a plane, a faint arc beside the table chosen over years by the turn of bodies reaching for what they should not grip. She pressed her ear to the vent and heard nothing but the breath that had learned its courtesy. She lay her palm on the door seam and felt no hint of warmth nor cooling. She rapped her knuckles at intervals and the sound returned full, not hollow, not false, and if there was a corridor beyond it, its obligations were elsewhere. Hour 6 delivered a smell before it delivered an object, and the smell was not the antiseptic to which she had grown resigned nor the dusty patience of catalogued cloth, but the sweet, rancid sugar of lilies, the rot that attends arrangements too generous for the size of the room. And Elin moved toward the table with the involuntary caution of a person entering a church they don't believe in and finding their hand nonetheless moving toward holy water. There lay a funeral card sealed in polyethylene, the front a reproduction of a saint with an expression that belonged not to heaven or to earth, but to a classroom where the children had learned that stillness would be graded. Inside, a printed prayer, a line for a name, filled in with the aching love of Toner, Joel Madsen, 1968 to 2016, and beneath it a photo cropped to the shoulders because the body below had been unhelpful, Joel looking at the lens with the mild amusement of a man who has learned that everyone regards him as kinder than he is and who intends to fulfill the misconception until the day demands a different officer. Ellen held the card through its sleeve and discovered her fingers trembling, not because Joel was gone. They had all done their trembling then and in private, and the world had not profited from it, but because she recognized the font, the printer, the crease where someone had folded the card badly in a pocket and then smoothed it flat before putting it in the box that would go into someone's closet, and then into someone else's attic, and then into the hands of a property clerk who would never have met Joel and would file his name between Madison, N.L., and Magdalena, S. And how the room had acquired this, she did not invite it to explain, because explanation can be the cruelest kind of generosity. The ledger on the table opened a fraction by itself, a breeze that could have been from the vent telling a little lie, and on the first page her name depressed itself a little deeper into the paper, and the room permitted her the mercy of not pretending it had not noticed her want. Ellen took the pen that had not been there and now lay in the ledger's gutter, heavy, old, the sort that makes you think of depositions and wills and the good ink that bleeds. She considered writing in long, foolish, flourishing strokes about bad coffee and better partners, about mothers whose eyes never forgave the police who tried to be compassionate in the vocabulary of bureaucracy, about the way seasons lodged in the sleeves of jackets in the evidence room, and the way the jackets had all been cut for men because no one had thought yet that women would stand weeping in such rooms without permission. Instead, she wrote simply and too carefully to be read without a lamp. Hour 6. You have my attention. If you want my memory, you will give me yours. Hour 7 answered. Not with food like a decent captor or with water
Chapter 3,
like an interrogator who intends to keep the subject
arrived with the
technically
patience
alive,
of a clerk,
but with a
the
thin
sort
manila
that
folder
pinches
pale
paper
from
as
the
old
edges to
dentures,
avoid smudging
and
the
inside
evidence.
it a single sheet
and
typed
with
on
a
a
thirst
machine
that
that had
belonged
belonged
less
to
to the
someone
mouth
who
than to
loved
the
metal.
mind. The
A
letters
dry
scrape
crisp
at the
and
place
slightly
slightly raised the
questions
way
joined,
type used to be
and
before it
Ellen,
learned to be a
who had
simulation,
interrogated men into
and the sheet
confessing
conveyed a
thirsts
truth
they didn't
that
know the
tripped
names for,
and then sat up,
recognized the
autopsy
tactic,
supplement,
and
refused
refused to grant it a clear desk,
followed by a.
She stood and
note
paced
in a
the
pathologist's
boundaries as
courteous,
if drawing chalk around the
irritated
shape
hand.
of the room's idea of her
Ballistics
might
request
produce
delayed.
a perimeter the door
Projectile
understood.
misfiled.
The
It was
scuffs
the
on the
sort of line
concrete
that would
resolved
win a case
themselves
if you were
into
lucky
geographies,
and could produce
a
it in
small
front of a
world
jury
near the
that
bed
still
like a
believed
storm
in seen
sounds.
from a plane.
Here it yawned
A
like a
faint
small
arc
maw,
beside
and
the
Ellen
table
found
chosen
herself
over
angry
years
not at the
by the
room
turn of
any
bodies
longer,
reaching
but
for
at
what
the
they
small
should not
decision
grip.
that had allowed
She
someone to
pressed her
sign a
ear
page,
to the vent
and
and
then
heard
go
nothing
nothing
but the breath
telling
telling
any
any
of
of
them
them that
that
the
the
delay had become
She laid her
accustomed
palm on the door
and the
seam
custom a
and
burial.
felt no hint
She
of
resisted
warmth
the
nor
urge to
cooling.
say Riley's
She
name
rapped her
aloud
knuckles at
because
intervals,
names,
and the
once
sound
they are
returned
pronounced,
full,
enter into
not
contracts.
hollow.
She
Not
wrote it
false.
instead in the
And
ledger.
if there was a
Not
corridor
even the full
beyond it,
name,
its
only the
obligations
letter
were
and the
elsewhere.
two soft vowels.
Hour 6
R.
delivered a
And then
smell
she
before
placed
it
the pen
delivered an
down
object,
and put her
and the
forefinger on the
smell was
line,
not the
as if
antiseptic
to pin
to
the
which
letter
she
to
had
the
grown
paper,
resigned,
so it
nor
would
the
not
dusty
creep off the
patience
page
of
on its
catalogued
own into the
clock,
corner,
but
where
the
rats
sweet
learn
rancid
Latin.
sugar of lilies.
The clock made
The
its
rot
patient
that attends
noises.
arrangements,
The room
too
let the
generous
smell
for
of
the size
lilies
of the room,
dissolve into
and
the
Ellen moved
antiseptic
toward the
silk
table
of
with
its
the
usual
involuntary
breath.
caution
Ellen
of a
closed
person
her
entering a
eyes and
church
did
they
not
don't
pray
believe in,
and did not
and
negotiate
finding their
and did
hand
not promise.
nonetheless moving
She simply
toward
stood until
holy
standing
water.
was a sentence.
There lay a
and then
funeral
she
card
sat until
sealed
sitting
in
learned to
polyethylene,
mean something else.
the front a
It is
reproduction
an
of a
awkward
saint
thing,
with an
perhaps
expression
the
that
most
belonged
awkward
not
the
to
working
heaven
mind
or to
encounters,
earth,
but
to
to
realize that you
classroom where the
occupy a
children had
story
learned
whose
that
author is
stillness
not
would
God
be
and
graded
not fate,
inside,
and not the set of
a
human
printed
decisions
prayer,
that
a
pretends to
line
be
for
fate,
name,
but the room
filled
itself
in with the aching love
she
of
had
toner.
stood in enough
Joel
kitchens with
Matson,
calendars blistered by oven heat to know how stories are born
and
out of
beneath it a
harmless
photo
lies,
cropped to the
and yet
shoulders
here the lie
because
kept
the
its
body
teeth
below had
politely
been
hidden,
unhelpful,
and she remained.
Joel looking
To
at
her
the lens
disgust,
with the mild
grateful.
amusement of
Hour
a man
8
who
brought
has
at last what the body
learned that
insists
everyone
upon.
regards him
A
as
metal
kinder
cup
than
with
he
water
is,
and a
and
plate
who
with two
intends to
crackers,
fulfill the
an
misconception
insult at the
until
level
the day
of technique
demands a
and
different
salvation
officer.
at the level of
Ellen
blood.
held the card
And she
through
did
its
not look for
sleeve and
fingerprints.
discovered her
She
fingers
did not
trembling
sniff for
not
chemicals.
because Joel
She
was
drank
gone.
and she ate,
They
and
had
she said
all done
thank
their
you aloud,
trembling
not to the
then
room,
and in
but
private,
to the God of
and the
small
world had
continuances.
not profited from
And
it.
she felt the
But
breath
because
of the
she
vent grow a
recognized the
fraction
font,
warmer,
the
because
printer,
kindness,
the crease where
even if
someone had
simulated,
folded the card
warms
badly
the
in a
throat
pocket
that
and then
receives it.
smoothed it flat
With
before
hour
putting it in
9
the
came
box that
something
would
the
go
room
into
had
someone's
not yet
closet,
tried,
and then
sound
into
not
someone
on
else's
tape,
attic,
but within
and
itself,
then into the
a
hands of
speaker
a
hidden
property
in a
clerk
surface
who
or
would
a
never
throat
have
hidden in the vent.
met
A
Joel
voice
and
that
would
was
file his
recorded
name
years
between
ago and
Madison
had none of the stutter of live
N.L.
fear,
and Magdalena
a man saying,
S.
property.
And how the room
Riley,
had
you got
acquired
it.
this,
She
in
did
that
not
same
invite it to
lazy,
explain,
obscene way he had
because
eaten
explanation
apples,
can
and
be
the
the
sound of
cruelest
something
kind
slid
of
across the
generosity.
counter,
And Ellen's own
the
voice
ledger on the
answering,
table
"You'll
opened a
love it."
fraction by itself,
And Riley saying,
a breeze that could have
"You're the
been from the
detective,
vent
write me
telling
a
a little
poem."
lie,
And
on
then
the first page
a
her
click
name
that might
might have been the end of a little deeper into
or
the
start
paper,
of a wound.
And the room permitted her the mercy of not pretending it had
she
not
knew that
noticed
instinctively.
instinctively. Ellen took the pen that had not been there and now lay in the ledger's gutter. Found it heavy, and in the finding had decided it belonged to her more than to any departmental archive. And this was the moment when she admitted that whatever evidence arrived henceforward flourishing might well be coming not only from the case that had put lines around mothers whose eyes never forgave the police who tried to be compassionate in order to let other files rise to the top about the way seasons lodged in the sleeves of jackets in the evidence room. And I will give you the inventory of my errors if you give me what I cannot subpoena. No one had thought yet that women would stand weeping in such rooms without permission. The letters sat in their depressed grooves like sleeping fish under winter read without a lamp. She did not know whether she had just confessed you have my attention. Kept herself company. If you want my memory, you will give me yours. When hour 10 began, she understood something like a decent captor. Every fourth delivery would be body. Every second would be voice. Subject. Every third would be paper. But with a thin manila folder for wanting the predictability you develop on surveillance. And inside it is counting cars typed on a machine that steps out of work at the 30-minute mark to smoke behind the letters crisp where we slightly raised the way type used to be before it learned to be a simulation and presented a ring of keys. Conveyed a truth that tripped and then battered. Institution supplement with a tag on which someone had written locker followed by 14. Note and her hand reached before her mind did. Irritated keys are hunger and metal ballistics request delayed. And when she held them, the skin of her palm remembered the exact weight. It was the sort of line that would win a case we handle. If you were lucky, so often the hand in front of a jury that and still believed in flash the locker room's blue-dented doors and the bench that had been bolted to the tile 2 years any longer. Someone realized small decision that had allowed someone to someone else realized and then go home to sleep without telling any of them that the delay had become a custom and the custom a burial. And she resisted the urge to say Riley's name aloud because past 12. Once they are pronounced, she looked at the blank door that was only a wall. She wrote it instead in the ledger, that was only a full name. She looked at the ledger that was only vowels. She sat and then held the keys and let the hour do its arithmetic on the line. And when the chime came, to pin the letter she did not look toward the table, so it would not toward the door page on its own into the corner. Stage play, at least now the exit would enter like a clock made its patient noises. The door remained decorous. The room let the smell of lilies dissolve into the antiseptic silk of its usual breath. And the room answered Ellen closed her eyes and did not Hart began to talk then, and did not negotiate. Not to the room as you talk to a dog. And not to herself as you talk to guilt, was a sentence, but to the ledger and then she sat into a sitting stenographer to mean something else. A pension. It is an awkward thing, to be told perhaps the most awkward about the way she had wanted so badly to realize that you author to have an answer. It was not have mattered to either of them if it were the wrong one, and not the about the way she had permitted Riley to act like a clerk, but the room itself treated him like a felon. She had stood in enough kitchens with calendars blistered by oven heat to know how stories are born out of harmless lies, and afterward had pretended she had not heard the difference politely hidden about the coin the task force had given her and the way she had placed it in a pocket with Hour 8 brought at last what the body and a couple of wrapped mints, a metal cup with water and a plate with 2 crackers, and then the universe had noticed the level of technique and punished her for trying to be untheatrical. And she did not spoke in long paragraphs. She did not. That was what the room wanted. She drank and she ate the short declaratives aloud, not to the guilt and joy, to the god of small continuances. And she felt to give it the luxury of a head fraction warmer. She gave it instead the layered, even if simulated, undignified truth warms that makes the throat that receives it. And judges impatient. With hour 9 came something the room had not yet tried. Fortunate, sound not on falls as it should on itself. A speaker hidden in a surface that is not years, but a page turned. A voice that was recorded years ago gave her a scrap of stutter burned at one edge. A man tight with a sour smell of smoke. Riley, you got Lozano stoop. In that same lazy, obscene way, he had eaten apples, had persuaded and the sound of something slid across a counter, and Ellen's own voice and the wallpaper to remember. You'll log it. That paste and Riley saying can be lovers. You're the detective. When hour 12 came, the room gave her a child's drawing that might have been the end of a call, for stick figures and a red shoe on one foot. The room had not on the other a blank oval. She knew that in the corner of the sun, wearing sunglasses, no glass, because that is how a certain year taught the sun. The room had found it. When hour 13 had decided it belonged to her more than to any departmental archive. Like a good dog, and this was the moment when she admitted that whatever evidence arrived henceforward might well be she allowed herself only from the case thing she had lines around her mouth, but from not every case that which is that the room itself was the unsolved to let other files rise. And she was the first detective it had invited not to exit but to report. I will perhaps the evidence. I will give you the inventory of my errors if you give me what I cannot. Child on a playground, and the ledger received a reputation without ink, and a clerk who the letters sat in their depressed grooves like sleeping fish under municipal building. She did not know whether she had learned to file its shame until shame became another word for furniture. She took up the ledger when hour 10 began. She understood something like a rule. Every fourth delivery would be body. Hour 13. Every second would be voice. There is no window by design. Every third would be paper. And yet I have been given many. She disliked herself for wanting the predictability you develop on surveillance. I must learn which one is a door. Counting cars, and as if the room had simply been waiting for the 30-minute mark to smoke behind the dumpster. The hour where hand pretend cameras do not watch. She had not seen the door opened. The chime sounded with a ring overtone like a second voice in a song learned harmony. Institutional. And from the seam of the door there came, on which someone had written locker B, not 14, air, and her hand reached before her mind striking hot iron somewhere far away. Metal form, a scent and when she held them the skin of her palm, remembered the exact weight, will soon be legible again. Objects we handle. And she stood to meet hour 14 makes a map of them. Only way out of rooms she saw in a flash the locker room's blue dented doors and the bench that had been bolted to the tile 2 years before someone realized hour 14 announced itself with that iron smell braided through the air like a political train. And she heard Joel laugh across time, the room seemed to lean without moving. The way a hallway leans toward a door that has just been knocked upon. Lucky number if you can count past 12. Felt an old muscle. She looked at the blank door that was only a wall. Belonged to mornings. She looked at the vent that was only a throat. Coffee was a she looked at the ledger that was only a mouth. And when she turned from the table and held the keys, she saw that the blank wall opposite the bed and learned a new geometry. She did not look toward the table, but toward the door because if her ribs hadn't told her, play at least now the exit would enter like more generous than a shift in the light's willingness to reflect. And centered on that seam of faint blue stencil, whose paint had been thin to transparency. Elin Hart began to talk then. Washings, not to the room as you talk to a dog, the kind of stencil a city buys by the carton, but to the ledger as one to an auditor notices the font has fallen out of fashion and deserves to be told which had been holding the ring about the way she had wanted so badly for that mother to have an answer. It would not have mattered to either of them if it were the wrong oldest argument about the way she had permitted Riley to ever learn to like their weight knows the way metal recognizes home, about the way Joel had slid, said the word partner like a vow, not grudgingly as drama likes to pretend, and afterward had pretended she had not heard the difference that has no opinion about the task force had given her and the way she had placed it in a pocket locker it was and unfolded not outward but inwards. Air whispering not wanted to treat it air of old gym socks, and then the universe had noticed that has seen its water for trying to be never forgiven the person who spilled it. She spoke in long paragraphs because that was what the room wanted. Just the bookkeeper's short declaratives onto which guilt enjoys fastening a manila envelope splayed at the corners from being opened the luxury of a headline. A rolled she gave it instead the layer with the first undignified truth that cautious way Riley used to do judges impatient. He could act like he was saving you time. If you are very fortunate, a laminated badge clipped to a lanyard on the day clean for the person who had borrowed it. That is not years, but a page swaddled in a towel that when hour 11 came, the room gave her a scrap of cloth burned at one edge, cradle, throat tight with the sour smell of smoke from the summer. The corner of it had been dressed in candles, face of a portable hard drive the size of a wallet, and the age of a compromise to catch. Its label peeled off to remember of adhesive writing EDAD can be lovers, and then silence. When hour 12 came, the drive on the table with the reverence drawing down crayon for ashes and stick figures and a red shoe on tried to become a sentence and on the other a blank oval, because there are times in the corner of the sun wearing sunglasses they are tools, because that is how a certain year taught the sun to behave. She opened the manila envelope because when hour 13 came, it gave her nothing and inside found a strip of negatives behaved like a good dog and sat at her feet like contraband its tail against the concrete like a metronome. 6 frames of a scene she allowed herself to think the thing she had been practicing. The Lozano stoop, not the candles, which is that the mother's hand lifted because hands do not learn grief and therefore perform detective it had invited and at the bottom frame a blur caught in the corner, and that perhaps the evidence appearing every 60 minutes belonged the shoulder of a man whose to a child on a playground to Riley or to any man who believes a government clerk who entitles him to all variations of specific cruelties and the time printed along the edge but to a city that had learned to file its shame until shame became another word for furniture, meant the photograph. She took up the ledger and wrote, minute before the hour the mother had mentioned on the paper rather than on the hour the building prefers when it wants to teach. There is no window by design. What schedules and yet I have been given there was a folded receipt. If I look long behind the badge, I must learn which one is a door. The thermal ink faded. The room had simply been waiting for the fantastic privilege of storage. The hour hand moved with a grace. Box 312. She had not seen in it. Paid cash. The chime sounded with an overtone like a second determination of a man who had never learned. And from the seam of the door there came. And if the signature wasn't Riley's, then the coincidence, but the smell of rain striking hot iron somewhere far away. The old violence any city cop can read as a promise that not from fighting, but from discovering a new drawer in a known to meet hour 14 because the only way out of rooms wrote in the ledger has ever been embossing the page with the neatness of a student trying to impress a strict teacher. Hour 14. B. 14 opened. Riley's habit all over the clean places. Storage unit named. I am likely the last person alive who knows what this means, and also the first person dead enough to be allowed to see it. The room took her line, the paper darkening fractionally where the depressions lay as if an ink from another hour were filling the trenches, and for the first time since the clock had begun its polite requisitions, she felt something like hunger for the next hour that had nothing to do with water, and everything to do with the way a story accelerates when it senses the end of its patience, which is to say she was afraid of wanting, and she had thought herself past that. Hour 15 did not care about the calendar she had built in her head. It sent a smell first. Not lilies this time, but river. Not the noble stink of a working harbor, but the tin taste of rainwater standing in a rusted drum. And when the drawer slid out, it carried a zipper bag textured like money and dirty in the corners with a fine black grit that took up light and refused to return it. The sort of bag anyone with secrets buys at a hardware store, and the sort of grit anyone with a boat recognizes, and inside the bag, as if the room thought it important to be specific, a handful of stamped brass tags with numbers and a logo that had once been crisp and now had the velveteen fuzz of age. Riverlock 3rd level, and the numbers ran like teeth: 310, 311, 312. So that she didn't have to pretend to be clever to understand the naming of the locker, and she found, because the room had a sense of humor that offended her less now that it had learned to be useful. A single quarter stuck to the plastic by Old Sugar, a laundry coin from the precinct's back room with a notch carved where someone had made a key for a vending machine once and never learned to be ashamed about it. She pressed the tags into her palm because some places live in the skin as well as in the map, and she remembered the storage facility gutted and refitted into upscale studios when the riverfront learned to pronounce the word artisan. She remembered the way the corridor lights had bled fluorescence into darkness like Tinkins bleeding into water. She remembered the way the unit doors had been the same pale blue as the stencils. She remembered a winter night when Joel had said, "If I die in an anecdote, press me into a coin and spend me back into a system that deserves me." And she had said, "I am not a pastor." And he had said, "No, you're worse. You're a detective." And they had both laughed because good men learn to laugh in doorways where they have learned what they cannot spend. The room, having delivered the geography, delivered then, with a slowness that pretended to be modesty, a sound at the vent that was not a voice and not merely air, more like the rustle of 1,000 envelopes opening, more like the way paper takes on damp, more like a courthouse breathing, and she felt the small hairs at the back of her neck commit to the politics of standing up, because the sound did not belong to any machine she had ever invited to her cases, nor to any human she had ever recruited to file them. It belonged to the phenomenon of bureaucracy waking in numbers, and the only reasonable thing to do when bureaucracy wakes is to confess faster than it can accuse. She wrote, "Hour 15, I took shortcuts. I believed coherence was kindness. I told Maria we would find an answer, and I meant it. And then I permitted the answer to be called insufficient by men who like to hear their own restraints described as weeping. I did not want to break Riley because breaking men breaks rooms, and I have loved rooms since the first time a precinct let me sleep sitting up and told me I was earning my name. Hour 16 rewarded neither the confession nor the memory, because this room did not play incentives, it curates." The drawer slid and produced, in a plastic sleeve so old its seams had learned to separate, a child's library card from the branch that used to sit at the corner, where the pawn shop is now. The name Eliana Lozano, carefully printed by a librarian who had taught printing with her own patient letters overlaid by tiny hands, a list of books on the back. The ink bled into fibrous paper so that the titles looked like softened bones. Seahorses and a book of shoes and the secret stair, and then circled. Once, twice, our river, and someone had drawn a star next to it in a pencil that had not been sharpened enough, and the star had 2 arms longer than the others the way children draw, as if they are trying to tell you which direction matters. It would have been one of 10,000 sweet tragic ephemera if not for the fact that inside the sleeve, stuck to the laminate with the ferocious cling of cheap plastic, there was a hair, not dark enough for Maria, not gray enough for Riley, too long and too fair for Joel, and it caught the room's light and sent it back a complicated, strand-thin line. And for a second, she felt the impatient heat of all the years between then and now cross her face with a hand and a demand. She did not open the sleeve because the room preferred its DNA devotional, not sacramental. She simply set it next to the sneaker and the voice and the bullet and the coin and the keys and the tags. And she said out loud to no one she would admit to speaking to, "You are building an altar that refuses candles." And the clock let the minute hand kiss the hour with the chastity of clocks, while the hour hand, indifferent, trailed on. By hour 17, the ledger had begun to fill itself, not with words. Those still required the small ethics of her hand, but with headings, the top of each page gently impressed with titles she had not chosen. What was taken, what was kept, what was traded, and under what was kept the light pressed into the page an even fainter pair of letters, YH, which was either cruel or benevolent. And she did not ask the room to clarify, because clarification is more often an instrument of torture than of understanding. The drawer provided a small sealed bag of soil, the label printed in the old Labs de Matrix, Silt Sample, Riverlock, Bay 3, and when she cracked the seal, the smell rose, with the faint tin florality of drowned metal and the warm bread smell of mold that hasn't learned to be dramatic, and she remembered kneeling once in a storage corridor with Joel as he scraped a sample into a film canister because they had run out of proper baggies. Both of them laughing, because scavenging is among the first arts police learn, and she could not for the life of her recall why the sample had been taken, who had ordered it, where it had been stored, and she wrote under what was taken in a neat school hand that would have earned her a gold star, "My own memory," in little legal bites. The room accepted the indictment and refused to apologize, which is, Elin thought, what good rooms and good parents have in common. They provide, and they do not perform. Hour 18 brought sleep anchored to the bed by the ankle, a sleep that skimmed the surface like a reluctant skater reading ice for cracks and refusing to pretend the cracks were art. And she dreamed that the room had windows after all, but that the windows looked into other rooms that had been disassembled and shelved. A library of failed exits catalogued by a clerk with handwriting so correct it made her want to spill coffee on it. And when she woke, the clock had done its arithmetic without her, and the door seam had warmed by a degree not because anyone human stood behind it, but because the building that housed all the buildings that had ever contained her cases had turned in its larger sleep. Hour 19 brought at last what every interrogation, even the ones with lights too bright for dignity, eventually offers. A question, not recorded, not spoken, but written in the ledger without ink, the letters pressed into the paper like footfalls in snow. What do you owe the body? And she laughed because the room had chosen a question both literal and theological, because the case had taught her that the body you owe is often not the body you find, because her own body had been owed to precinct couches and bad coffee and the obligation to go first so that children, when rescued, would find a door open rather than a wall. She wrote slowly, letting the depressions carve righteousness into the page. I owe the body a name, and I owe the name a witness, and I owe the witness a door that opens somewhere better than down. Hour 20 honored the answer with the least dramatic thing possible. It offered her a chair, which is to say it put a second chair in the room where there had been one, a steel tube relic with the seat worn smooth by uniforms, and the gesture made her throat sting more than the lily card had, because no room gives you a second chair unless it intends to sit down opposite, and you cannot do your work unless someone sits where the suspect sits, and you cannot do your penance unless someone plays the part you wrote for them back when you still believed in minor gods. She waited for the room to occupy its own chair, and when it did not, she took the seat herself and addressed the empty. You want Riley, and you want me, and you want Joel, and if you can't have us in 1 hour, you will have us in 24. You will build the case the way the city builds statues, by accretion and hypocrisy, and then you will reveal you were not building a case at all, but a way to make time participate in due process. Hour 21 came with the tape hiss again, and the mother's voice again, and her own too-even question again, and then, not quite between the words but beneath them, a second voice that had never existed on the original, a child's breath learning how to be careful in a microphone, and Elin felt the skin along her arms pebble because the room had permitted itself a lie, and she had to decide whether to reward innovation. She did not stop the tape because to stop now would be to teach the room that she preferred fidelity to possible truth, and the child did not speak, and the mother finished her sentence, and the machine clicked off, and the room said nothing in its own defense. Hour 22 was a coin again, not the task force token with its pompous Latin, but a subway token from a year before tokens gave up and became cards. The raised Y of the cities name a little map of tunnels on her palm, and there was a smear of something on the token that could have been machine oil, and could have been the sort of grease that never leaves a man's clothes even after 3 washings. And she understood that the room was telling her what Maria had told her without knowing she had. She took the red ones because you bought them, and she took the train because children know the way away, and she wasn't taken from the playground. She left, and Elin, who had hated every cop who suggested it in the weeks after because the hypothesis felt like an accusation against a mother who had already been indicted by grief, allowed the possibility to sit in the chair opposite and take its hands out of its pockets. Hour 23 was a paper she had written herself, a memo to a lieutenant who had preferred cigars to work, detailing the evidence as it then stood and requesting a warrant for a man who had turned out to be merely unpleasant rather than efficient. And at the bottom of the memo Joel had written, in pencil, "You sound like you are building a story rather than telling one," and she had circled it and written back, "We only ever do one." And she had forgotten the exchange until the room pinned it to the corkboard of her hours, and she wondered whether the door seam would cool if she wept, and if so, whether that would be extortion or physics. Hour 24 arrived, and the clock chimed not once but twice, soft, then softer, and the seam at the door widened by the thickness of a coin. No more. Light not entering, but the smell of rain on iron intensifying, and from the seam a thin rectangle folded out like the mouth of a suggestion box, and within it a single object made itself politely available, a key far older than locker rooms and storage units. A warded skeleton thing you could only buy now at an antique mall curated by a man. In suspenders, and attached to it by string a label from a courthouse that had been demolished to make room for a courthouse. Evidence. Room 0, and on the back, in a hand that was neither clerks nor cops, just tidy, just insistent, the window is a lie. The door is a memory. Turn, and Elin, who had been turning keys and cases and rooms for 20 years and had not turned her own mind with anywhere near the ferocity, put the key between her fingers and did not, for one entire careful minute, pretend she understood which lock it belonged to. She wrote in the ledger, pressing deep, because this was a contract she would sign in absence of ink. Hour 24. I am willing to turn. I will do it with both hands. I will not look away. If the door opens onto a room without windows, I will count again. And the breath from the vent matched her own for the first time since she had woken, and she understood then, with the complicated gratitude that belongs to grown women who have had to teach themselves to stop apologizing for breathing, that the room had never been asking for confession or for obedience, not exactly, but for participation, for the kind of collaboration that makes evidence become proof, and proof become justice, and justice become the thing people cannot quite describe without sounding foolish, and therefore must perform with too much ceremony and too little grace. And she stood, and she reached for the seam, and she placed the key against the slot the way you place a palm against a child's forehead to check for fever. And she said, not to God, and not to the room, and not even to Joel or Maria or the child with one red shoe, but to the ledger, which had agreed to memorize her, count with me, and she turned. Chapter 5, Room 0. The turn was not the triumph of a tumbler capitulating to metal, but the persuasion of a throat opening to a spoonful of water, a soft acceptance that felt less like mechanism and more like etiquette, and as the key completed its arc with a resistance that belonged to habit rather than to malice, the seam widened the way a scar concedes to stretch when the skin beneath it decides there is work to be done. And Elin, who had opened doors in tenements where the hinges had rusted to resolve, and doors in precincts that had forgotten courtesy, and doors in hospitals where grief had replaced policy, understood that this was a different category of opening altogether, because it did not reveal light or corridor or sudden air, but a shallow slot just wider than the ledger, and lined with felt the color of old judicial robes, and in that slot, resting as if it had been waiting to be noticed for hours that had constituted their own republic, lay a card the size of an index and the weight of a municipal decree, embossed in black like a funeral invitation and stamped with 2 words that felt inevitable the instant her eyes received them: Room 0. There was no question of whether to take the card, because the human hand is older than caution and had been taught by childhood libraries and adult courthouses alike that flat paper with raised letters tends to produce rooms and rights. So she slid it out and found that the felt-lined slot accepted the ledger in its place with a greedy exactness, the book settling as if the shelf had been built for it in another decade, and the slit, when it had eaten the ledger, closed again so neatly that if she had not kept the key between her fingers like a talisman, she could have convinced herself she had imagined the swallow. The card, when turned, bore a sentence written in a hand that was not clerkly and not police, and not the tidy calligraphic pride of a pathologist who enjoys being the last to see and the first to say, but something older and meaner and more patient. The window is a lie. The door is a memory. Present what you would swear on and step forward. She stood there long enough for the air to notice her waiting and adjust itself, because the next move mattered in a small way that would become large if she lied to it, and she enumerated the things she could present that were not theater. The task force coin with its Latin that belonged to men who preferred maxims to decisions. The subway token with its history of pockets. The library card that held more life than any badge. Joel's funeral card that had not asked to be picked up at all. The keys to the locker that had already done their work and might turn resentful if kept. The ring on her finger that was no longer a marriage and no longer a religion, merely a bias toward possession that the mind acquires when it has been required to hand too much away. In the end, she selected the smallest and the most expensive. She laid the subway token on her tongue the way a person tastes a sacrament that refuses to be bread, and then she took it back out with 2 fingers and set it on the threshold of the scene. Because if she had learned anything in rooms without windows, it was that promises become true only when touched by a mouth. The seam recognized the metal with a courtesy that suggested old acquaintance, and this time when she pressed the key and turned, there was the sense not of a door swinging or a slot feeding, but of a perspective shifting, as if the entire room had taken one step sideways and the geometry had decided to pretend it had always belonged to a different set of rules. And where there had been concrete, there was now a narrow corridor too honest to be subterranean and too finished to belong to any municipal building she had worked in, a passage with walls the color of filed paper and a floor of scuffed stone that had once been polished every other Tuesday by a janitor who remembered names and despised rank, and 6 paces ahead. Elin counted because counting has saved more people than prayer, and no one writes hymns about it. There stood a door without handle and without hinges, but with the authority of a courthouse and the meekness of a chapel, marked with a plaque whose letters were hammered the way old printers used to press words into lead. 0. She did not knock because there was nowhere to place her knuckles that would satisfy either of them, and she did not wait for permission because the vent's breath behind her had accelerated to a rhythm she recognized in her own sternum. So she placed her palm flat where the seam suggested it would be most startled, and exerted the kind of pressure a person uses on a wound when the ambulance has been called but cannot yet be seen. And the slab moved in not with a hiss or a groan, but with the sigh that heavy doors produce when they have been correctly asked, and room 0 revealed itself without drama, because drama is a resource it had already withdrawn. It was a space that had learned to impersonate basements and attics and waiting rooms, a rectangular volume edged in shelving that did not bother with labels because it did not intend to share, and on the shelves, not boxes or binders, but a library of doors the size of dictionary volumes. Hinged little panels with brass scutcheons that said things like Riverlock / 1976 to 2011 and evidence / misfiled / see also, and in the center of the room a table that was not the steel of the place she had woken in, but oak rubbed to a dull grateful sheen by 100 heels of hands, and on the table a blotter and a fountain pen, and a folded square of linen that the throat knew was for covering mouths, and on the far wall a photograph that had no frame and no source, yet that held itself the way a river holds ice, a black and white panorama of the city's underplaces, culverts fat with darkness, low rooms full of filing, riveted arches supporting corridors that had no need to exist. And at first she disliked its presence as too theatrical, and then she loved it because it was accurate to the way knowledge occupies architecture. Room 0 did not announce a clerk because that would have been tender, and it did not offer a chair because it had counted the events of the last hour and determined that standing would accuse her into honesty, but it did provide, near the oak, a set of 3 index drawers whose metal pulls had been polished by a very specific kind of anxious hand. And when she slid open the first, the smell that met her was precisely that of an old map case, linen paper, ancestor dust, a pinch of vanished glue, and the cards within were typed, Not with the film-fed smoothness of later offices, but with the small, clean strikes of a machine that had been oiled in the winter of a union dispute, and she found the card for Lozano, Eliana, 1999, unsolved, and she found beneath it a card for Madsen, Joel, 2016, procedural, and she found beneath that a set of 6 cards that should not have existed at all, and nevertheless lay here with the calm of furniture, Riley, Patrick, various, dispositive. There is a feeling the body gets in certain places where something finally matches the shape of your dread, a loosening of the shoulders even as the stomach tries to remember how to be stone, and Ellen felt that now as she ran her finger down the columns of notations marked seen/taken/returned, the smallest words making the largest demands, and she spoke aloud because room 0 had the kind of acoustics that demanded long sentences and punished slogan, and she said, "I will not ask you for mercy because I do not believe in it when walls are making choices, but I will ask you for jurisdiction. If you can hold what was misfiled, then you can release it to someone who intends to refile it correctly, which is to say under the right name and into the right hands and with the right light on it when day finally ends its performance." And as if the table had been waiting for any petition that was not a prayer, the fountain pen moved by an inch, and room 0 rolled a panel aside in the river. Photographed to reveal not glass and not brick, but a slot just like the one in her waking room, and a packet slid out into existence with a slowness that punished greed. It was a case envelope thick as a cheap Bible and hand-numbered in ink that had grown from black to tobacco brown, and written across the face were 3 versions of the same word in 3 hands: chain, 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 and someone. She suspected Joel because a man who writes in pencil on memos also draws cartoons on folders, had sketched a little chain whose middle link had been filed partway through, like a puzzle with a joke that was the opposite of a joke. She did not open the envelope yet because having wanted a thing for years makes you superstitious about being granted it, and besides, room 0 had opened the way the first threshold had, by asking that she present and swear and step. So she laid her palm flat on the linen square and said the thing she had refused to say on any stand except the interior one you carry. I, Detective Elin Hart, will put this where it belongs and will fail in public if I fail at all. And the photograph on the wall did not move, but the corridor beyond it rearranged itself in a way she could feel in the soles of her shoes, as if floors had learned to learn. She slipped the envelope under her coat, and darts of sweat found her lower back because fear is specific as an address when it arrives. And she took the Riverlock card from the index because there is no point pretending you will remember the wording once you leave a room that writes it for you. And as she turned the door, did the courtesy of pretending it had always been a door and nothing more. The seam accepted the key as if this had been practiced, and the corridor exhaled her back into the room without windows, and the smell of iron rain had shifted into the smell the street holds after a storm, when everything's relief is vulgar and you don't mind. The clock had not advanced by more than a minute, which told her something about room 0, and about how promises behave when architecture decides to be mathematical, and the ledger had returned to the table without having moved, which told her that someone had taught the room about continuity, and there on the page where her last sentence had been pressed now lay a counterpart in the same invisible ink from another hand entirely. Accepted. Evidence reissued on recognizance. Hour continues, and she looked at the door and said, without bitterness, because sometimes etiquette deserves not to be punished, "Thank you for clarifying that I am a defendant," and the breath in the vent, which had been matching her, resumed its officious professionalism, which was, if not comfort, then at least policy. Chapter 6, Riverlock. It is one thing to hold tags with stamp numbers in a room that has never seen the weather, quite another to stand in the imagined corridor of a storage facility that no longer exists and feel your ankles learn the slant of concrete poured in an age when water was a formality rather than a code, and when the hour chimed with the subdued precision it had come to favor. Less bell than calendar. Ellen watched the far wall perform a cheap magic with the seriousness of a surgeon. One section of paint, cooling as though rain had been applied to its reverse, and then blistering in slow motion until it shed its green in a rectangle and showed behind it the dull, brave blue of a line of doors with their little chrome hasps and their padlocks fat with indifference, and a sign stenciled crookedly, because that is how signs align in such places when the man with the level has gone home. Riverlock, level 3, Bay 300 to 320, and the light that came from nowhere learned for the occasion to be the light of a single fluorescent that has never been replaced because no one wants to test the string. She did not hurry because hurrying makes rooms clever, and she did not stroll because strolling teaches your fear to gossip. She walked with the pace of a night cop who knows he will have to run in a minute and does not intend to waste wrists on preliminaries. And as she came within reach of 312, she saw that the padlock was both present and not. Present because the brass was cold in a way that could not be faked and carried the fingerprints of a decade's worth of hurried men, and not because the shackle had been cut through cleanly at some earlier date. The severed ends pressed back into proximity as if the lock had decided to pretend it had remained intact to preserve the story a storage facility tells itself, and she slid the lock out of its hasp and placed it in her pocket because metal that has lost its narrative should not be discarded. Inside, the unit was the warehouse of a man who did not believe in maps. 5 boxes of bankers' kind sagging at the bottom in a manner that would make an honest record-keeper blush, a canvas duffel that had learned politics from the trunk of a car, 2 milk crates with their handles taped for comfort, and on the back wall a shelving unit taken from a different life, the kind you buy for a pantry and then fill with what you cannot eat. She recognized the duffel before her hand found the zipper, because the brand had been briefly popular with detectives with back pain, and she recognized the handwriting on the banker's lids, block, boyish, slightly leftward, because she had read it on requisitions and on jokes taped to vending machines, and on one half of a Christmas card that had also contained an apology, and she disliked the way her heart performed a small, specific rut in her chest, as if afraid of repeating itself. She opened one box and found what all cops find in such boxes eventually. Pieces of former lives and former cases cohabitating like tenants who will not speak to one another, a chain of evidence forms with addresses that had learned to be wrong, a roll of prints that were not from her case, and would remain unrolled until a different room decided to profess curiosity. A stapled sheaf of invoices written to a shell company that sold maintenance supplies to places that will never admit to having purchased their bleach from a man who laughs at murder. A Polaroid with the brownish patience of old chemistry showing a child on a train platform standing on the yellow line the way city children do when they want to see the world arrive before their parents do. The child's left shoe a red low top and the right shoe the same but missing, as if a magician had removed it from the picture to make her balance interesting, and behind the child, reflected in the glass of the closed snack stand, the shoulder of a man whose coat could have been any man's coat, and therefore will always be the coat the wrong man wore. The duffel yielded something heavier and less proud, a gray tape recorder, the sort that sits on a desk and learns to listen without judgment, its battery compartment secured with a strip of gaffer tape that had gone soft around the edges with heat, and taped to its lid a note in a hurried hand that even men who do not care adopt when they have stolen time from a worse authority. Studio/clean voices/dump later. And she did not invent a ghost when she read it because ghosts grow fat on invention. But she did imagine Riley standing in an empty unit with his collar open learning the trick of recording in a room that had neither echo nor conscience. And she thought, with the weary fairness she reserves for men who failed better than most, that he had not started out to be a thief of children or bullets or truth. He had started out to be a good enough clerk in a department that rewarded the illusion of neatness. And the river had swallowed what the building had exhaled, and the city had performed the trick it always performs, which is to suggest that separate systems may consume their own flaws as long as no one is unlucky enough to see their groaning. She found a plastic grocery bag with 3 things in it that made her throat tighten in 3 different ways. A half-eaten bag of sunflower seeds that had turned their salt chalky with time, a pair of latex gloves turned inside out the way a man does when he believes he is being watched by his better self, and a little spiral notepad like the kind that fits a coat pocket and has been accused by 10,000 prosecutors of unreliability. And in that pad a calendar of small selfishnesses. Notes about lunches, and about a woman known only by initial, and about a dog who needed walking, and about a locker that would need replacing because the sergeant had started noticing, and none of it was villainous enough to justify the way the hair on her arms had lifted when she saw it, and all of it combined into a portrait that explained itself if you allowed the smell of river to continue coming under the roll-up door in your mind. On the pantry shelf at the back was a row of hard drives wrapped in dish towels, 4 of them. the towels mismatched and laundered badly and stolen probably from a break room, and each with a little tag cut from a manila folder and stapled to the corner. LOZ 1, LOZ 2, Joel, VAR. And she wanted to take them all because greed is the only honorable reply when confronted with a system that has declared itself a stomach. But she knew what the ledger had asked her to vow, so she selected LOZ 1. And Joel, because the case had made a contract with her flesh, and she left VAR because even in rooms without windows, some doors must be opened in public if they are to matter, and she took a photograph of the remaining drives with the phone that the room had not confiscated because it had no interest in connecting her to any place but itself. And she put the photograph back in her memory because the phone could be made to lie in a way a brain cannot be forced to in rooms that have learned to count. When she stepped back into the room with its clock and its vent and its table, the rectangle of storage facility peeled away like a decal in warm water and left behind only the felted smell of dish towel and a specializing sadness that her profession had taught her to call by the wrong name, and the ledger, which had accepted her last humiliation with decorum, now offered a new heading pressed into the next page. Exhibits. TO be entered, sworn, and she arranged on the table the drives, the tags. The Polaroid, the sunflower seeds because her cruelty is practical, and she wanted to show the room she had learned to be particular, and she took the fountain pen and wrote slowly across 3 lines, Hour 16 plus river time. Unit 312 was a lie made useful. Polaroid shows a departure rather than an abduction, and might be the vile kindness the story deserves. Joel's ghost is a drive wrapped in a towel, and I am capable of carrying more than 2 things without falling. The chime, when it came, carried a sympathetic vibration that could have been her bones or the vent or the drive platters adjusting their old, hard prejudice against movement, and the door seam breathed rain that had decided to be testimony, and Ellen found herself imagining, for the first time since she had awakened in the chalk-pale chamber with its clock too polite for mercy, that perhaps the exit would not be an opening at all, but a submission, not of herself to the room, but of the room to daylight. The way buildings eventually let their roofs go and spill their secrets into alleys where ants and children and reporters learn new nouns for rot. Chapter 7. The Interview Without a Tape. It began, as true interviews begin, with the detritus of an ordinary room deciding it had always been an audience, the bed straightening its corners as if it wore uniform, the table offering a posture rather than a surface, the clock refusing to look anywhere but where looking had been assigned, and when Ellen sat because the hour made sitting a verb and not a rest, she discovered that the second chair, which the room had given her during the earlier hour and asked her to pretend not to notice, had placed itself opposite with a neatness that suggested appointments kept and notes prepared, and though no one sat there, a pressure like a held breath arranged itself into the shape of attention, and she understood with the old professional delight that belongs to any cop still in love with her craft that this would be done without tape, and that therefore nothing she said could be demanded in discovery, and everything she said would be binding. Tell me the part you never put in an affidavit, the empty chair said without speaking, because questions have a way of being communal when the past has decided to listen, and Ellen smiled because she had trained herself into that unfair skill, the one that makes a suspect believe you are eating the same bad sandwich as he is, and she said, I tell you that I loved the part of my job that involved rooms and rules and sentences, and the way a door will keep most promises if you address it correctly, and I confess to you that I avoided the part that involved kids and winter boots and the indignity of sitting on a mother's couch while her family tried to give me coffee and their need, because I am not holy and never wanted to be. I wanted to be competent. And the chair did not nod because acknowledgement would have made it human, and the room was trying very hard to remain architecture. Tell me the fault you hung on Riley that you inherited yourself, the air said without producing vibration in the vent, and because there was no tape to judge inflection, she allowed herself the length of a sentence that did not worry about an interruption, and she said, I thought neatness, paper aligned, badges shined, chain of custody form signed in capitals, was kin to righteousness. And so, when a man imitated neatness, I mistook his mimicry for allegiance, and let him carry what should have stayed in my hands, which is how a sneaker leaves a box, and a bullet leaves a tray, and a drive wrapped in towel sits on a shelf making mechanical plans. Tell me what you owe Joel, the clock said, and she allowed herself to watch the hour hand while she answered, because watching time gives certain promises the courage to be literal, and she said, I owe him the embarrassment of admitting that he warned me more often than I warned him. And I owe him the relief of hearing me say that he was kinder than he needed to be and softer than the job rewarded, and that a certain hardness would not have saved him, because fate is not an economy, and I owe him the pleasure of a derisive snort across a bar when he hears that I finally took a case to a room that did not belong to men or to citizens at all, and I owe him the grace of a funeral where the speeches did not lie, and the clock rewarded her with the only moral time keeps, which is to continue. Tell me the child's name, the ledger asked, though of course it had written it twice in its own mouth, and Elin said, Eliana, River, library card with a hair that glowed like a filament, red shoe, yellow line, summer that did not deserve its warmth. And at the word river the vent tried to make rain and failed. And at the word shoe the Polaroid on the table lifted one corner in the stirring of photograph sometimes performs when someone willing to swear on it is present. And at the word library card the smell of paste rose from somewhere that could not possibly be the shelf, because nothing in this room had been bound with glue. What will you do if the room returns you? The second chair asked with the entitlement of furniture that has been enlisted as tribunal, and it would have been easy to say the heroic thing. Surge down corridors with a sheaf of warrants and a stern mouth and a set jaw and a ring of keys that behaved like miracles. But she had trained too long for that vanity, so she said instead, I will make copies, many, boring, correct. I will invite daylight into buildings that resist it by holding press conferences that sound like eulogies and eulogies that sound like briefings. I will bring a drive wrapped in towel to a judge with a record of quitting and pretend not to notice his hands are shaking. I will apologize to Maria for years in which I called her Ms. Lozano because I thought respect was formal rather than specific. I will tell the people who like to say words like closure that this is not a window that opens and bangs shut in a gust. It is a door that must be held and propped with an ugly rubber wedge and guarded by men who need to pee at inopportune times. I will insist that some part of the city's money be spent on clean rooms and clean minds. I will sit where a child can see me and take notes in longhand with poor penmanship so that she knows we are not computers. I will refuse to put my name on a plaque. I will carry sunflower seeds to the river and feed them to a gull that has learned to recognize detectives. And the chair made no note and required none. Then present what you would swear on. The room said, this time is paper because the ledger had leaned its pages back to welcome her palm, and Elin Hart, who had sworn on Bibles and on badges and on children's heads and on her own manipulations, chose the cleanest simplicity on the table, which was the square of linen folded for covering mouths, and she laid her hand upon it and said, almost conversational because the room had taught her to be precise, I give you not my life, because it is spoken for by other, older contracts, but my hours, which are mine to spend and might as well be employed. And in reply the seam breathed and the clock chimed once, and behind the breath of the vent, very faint, as if a courthouse 2 blocks away had stuck in its throat and chosen to cough, there came the heavy, humorless sound of a door in a chain of doors unseating itself from habit. She did not spring to it because springing is what the room punished. She did not tiptoe because there were no surfaces here which believed in being surprised. She stood and took up the evidence she could carry without looking theatrical. 2 drives, the Polaroid, the library card, the funeral card though it served no one and only hurt, the half-eaten seeds because rooms have a taste for irony. And with the key cold in one coat pocket and the cut padlock warm in the other she approached the seam, which now looked less like a seam and more like a suggestion being honored out of politeness, and the linen square, when she picked it up, had warmed, which meant room 0, which was somewhere else, had done something she had asked, and she felt her most unacceptable emotion, which was hope, and decided, as she has for 20 years, to behave as if hope were not dangerous. The door did not open to daylight or to precincts or to applause. It opened to a stairwell that had taught itself to mimic those municipal stairwells that lead up from basements into hallways where buff paint and bulletin boards and drinking fountains find their shared purpose, and the tread under her boot had the slightly hollow give of poured steps over a utility void, and the handrail was round and indifferent. And when she ascended the first flight, the air tasted less of antiseptic and more of dust the way books exhale it. And when she reached the landing and took the second flight, the light assumed the wattage of bulbs that can be reached with a broom, and at the top. Not the top, because the top is not a place in such buildings, but the top for now. The door had a wire glass panel and, hilariously, an exit sign with one tube out, and behind the glass a darkness that was not dangerous. Not yet, just municipal night. And as she pushed, the door resisted with institutional fairness, and then allowed her to win. It was not freedom, because freedom is not a hallway, but it was its cousin, the corridor of a building you could enter with a key or leave without one, linoleum with seams, a corkboard crowded with curling municipal announcements in fonts that have had a good life. Meeting. Community Police Advisory. Notice. HVAC maintenance missing. Red sneaker. And she had no patience left for anyone's sense of humor, the universe included. So she moved down the hall and found that the light grew to accept her, and that somewhere off to the left a door labeled stairs TO lobby had decided to be honest, and that the smell of the river was far off and the smell of coffee was nearer, and she realized with a lurch in her stomach she had not eaten anything living in a day, and she laughed in a way that would make a child trust you and a lieutenant assign you to nights, and behind her the room without windows balanced its ledger, and the clock returned to a schedule that would ask for less than everything. She pushed the lobby door with her shoulder and met tile you could mop and a glass vestibule that reflected a version of her that could be photographed, and a desk without a sergeant, and a flag that had been ironed, and beyond the glass the urban twilight that belongs to morning in a city that does not respect day and night as old gods, so much as shifts as a payroll. And she kept moving, because if you stop in lobbies, rooms find you again. And she thought, with a steadiness that surprised nothing in her, that she would have time to fail, and that the room had provided her with the materials to make that failure useful. And she began to plan, the way she plans in the shower and in traffic. Judge who hates being mentioned in the paper, assistant DA who is a child in the same grade as a grief she holds by name, reporter who will print if fed slowly, priest who will aim a microphone at a river and call it compassion, and somewhere in there a door back, because doors that have admitted you once will admit you again, particularly if you bring items to return and names to say aloud and new headings pressed into a ledger that has learned to take dictation from breath rather than from ink. Behind her, in the room without windows that was also a room full of them if you learned to read properly, the clock let the minute hand land on the hour again and chimed once with that small satisfied tone of a watch tapped on a table at the end of a good story told badly, which is to say humanly, and the ledger closed its current page and lay still, and on the back of the funeral card, hidden by gravity until she turned it later, there was a penciled sentence in Joel's hand that had waited. Years for this hour, not a ghost. A room. Treat it right, and it testifies. Chapter 8. Daylight Procedure. The city did not greet her as a prodigal or a witness. It took her in with the modest reluctance you see in night clerks who have been left alone too many hours and have learned that everyone arriving at their desk believes they are the exception, and Elin, who had never been the exception to anything that mattered and was grateful for the discipline, kept to the fluorescent aisles of bureaucracy because she had always found that daylight, abused correctly, behaves like a disinfectant. She chose the building that would tolerate her without asking the wrong questions first. A courthouse annex whose marble had been dulled by 3 generations of shoe leather and hallway arguments, and at a counter edged with plexiglass and stubborn tape residue, she presented the only credentials that survived both politics and myth. A name they could look up without calling a supervisor. A case number that still had a heartbeat in the system because the city prefers its failures preserved in amber. And 2 objects wrapped in towel that she did not pretend to be ordinary, because even clerks inured to family court and parking violations respect linen when it is carried like a verdict. The assistant district attorney she liked least was the one she asked for because sentiment is a liability you can sell only once. Mara Klein wore a blouse that suggested she had already spoken to cameras and a mouth that told you she had enjoyed 2 hours of sleep and the delicious cruelty of a righteous deadline. And when Elin placed the drives and the Polaroid on the conference table in an interior room whose walls had learned to consent to secrecy, Mara refused to feign surprise and therefore earned Ellen's temporary gratitude. The chain of custody problem presented itself with the weary glee of a rule that knows it has the power to end scenes prematurely. Elin did not tell her about the room, or the ledger, or the chime that made hours into citizens. She slid, instead, a single card across the table, embossed black like the beginning of a prayer, Room 0, evidence reissued on recognizance, and in the corner a seal that looked municipal without inviting a phone call to verify it, and Mara's eyebrows performed the smallest offense, a rise held down by training. And then she smiled in a way that played nicely on microphones and said, "You brought me. Miracles with paperwork, Ellen, my favorite denomination." What the drives contained could not be trusted to be dramatic on cue, so they treated them like explosives, leaving the lids of their expectations unsealed. A tech with a conscience the size of a houseplant ushered a trolley with a clean machine into a room with a slanted window that had once allowed sunlight and now allowed only opinions, and when the first files blinked awake, their names carried the thin, embarrassing ambition of men who have not learned to hide their own plans. Clean_voices_a, front_gay_loop, Lozano_walk, and for a minute, which the clock in Ellen's sternum counted with the merciless serenity of a metronome, there was nothing to see but the text of directories and the cursive of a loading bar. And then the voice of a man who had adopted a friendly tone to disguise his fear poured from the speakers the way smoke leaves a kitchen and persuades the entire house to lie about its nature. "Property, Riley." The voice said in a room the recorder had been told to trust. "You got it." Followed by the fat silence that fills that sort of space before a woman who should not be in the room decides to be helpful. And in the background the faint whir of a climate control unit that belonged to a facility she had stood in an hour ago with plates of dust under the shelving and the river making its little iron jokes under the roll-up doors. And then another file. This one video. Oily in aspect ratio and monochrome, not because of age, but because Riley had liked the way black and white made him feel like a documentarian, and on the frame a corridor Ellen recognized from the Polaroid, the snack stand shuttered, the yellow safety line gray on gray, and into the frame, timid and ferocious the way only certain children are, stepped a girl with one shoe red and the other foot stubborn and bare, looking at the far end of the platform the way children look at horizons when they decide, disastrously, to be adults. Mara did not offer commentary because Mara liked to win in court and had discovered that practice in rooms like this makes you lazy. She watched and she wrote a name on a legal pad and then drew a line under it and wrote Chain, and then a second name, Madsen, and then a third, Riley, and she underlined that twice because no prosecutor on earth has ever resisted the vulgarity of pointing with pencil. "You have more," she said without resorting to questions meant to establish whether Ellen had broken a law, a truce, or a machine. Ellen said yes, without saying what quantity yes suggested, and Mara nodded at the door and sent an investigator to a judge who had, in her private life, a preference for noir films and the infuriating kindness to sign when kindness was not fashionable. Daylight permits a kind of choreography the night never learned, and Ellen used the morning like a crowbar, prying the case away from the narrative that had taught itself to enjoy its own bleakness. She made her apologies in advance, because apologizing after has the scent of contempt, and she presented Maria with a Polaroid she could choose to refuse, and when Maria's mouth formed the first sound Ellen had heard the day of the red sneaker, the sound that tried to be a name and failed but, nevertheless accomplished an indictment of the world. Ellen did not pretend to be holy. She was only who she was, an officer with a ledger pressed into her palm by a room that had learned to interrogate, and she said, carefully, "We will not say she ran. We will say she left." The law is better with verbs than adjectives. She visited a judge in chambers where the wood had learned to be important and where the blinds made stripes over cheeks that had once been softer. Judge Cho had the posture of a person who had discovered the political genius of refusing to lean, and when Ellen placed the reissue card on the desk, she did not blink because blinking gives tactics too much help, and when the judge asked, "On recognizance of whom?" Ellen said, "Of a room that is tired of being useful in the dark." And the judge wrote, slowly, with a pen that had embarrassed better men than Ellen, "Order to unseal misfiled evidence. In camera review, which is the polite way a system says it will look at a thing without the city looking back." A reporter had to be fed because daylight, unlike hunger, does not sustain itself on promises. She chose one with a merciful attention span and a dangerous respect for verbs, June Park, whose notepad contained fewer headlines than questions with the wrong number of articles in front of their nouns. Ellen gave her less than she had, and enough that she could claim sunlight had been invited, and June wrote a single sentence in the middle of the page and underlined it, as if that alone could entice a headline into behaving. Evidence returned to the living. By late afternoon, the floor of the annex had learned the rhythm of a quiet emergency, the kind that walls prefer because it forgives their age. A court officer whose eyebrows deserved their own pension brought coffee that tasted better than it had any right to. The drive labeled M, Joel produced, after an hour of files that were either void or cruelly irrelevant, a folder designed by a man who had not wanted to be found. /old/audio/desk/drafts, and inside that folder a file that had never been named, sitting on its belly like a fish, a date hung around its tail, 2016-07-02_untitled, and when they played it, the recorder's throat grabbed at the first second like a swimmer who has not breathed correctly for too many laps, and Joel's voice filled the room with the particular sorrow of men who have learned to be precise when they are 2 days away from death. "Ellen," Joel said without preamble, because men about to die do not flatter their subjects with appropriateness. "You made a teacher out of a room and I made a church, and only one of us deserves the penalties. I moved evidence to keep a mother from being torn apart by speculation that earned its clothes the minute it walked in. I took a bullet out of a chain because the chain went through a man who would have eaten that bullet like a communion wafer. I did not move it far. I thought a door would always open to let me put it back. I did not know men like Riley kept their doors in a place the river could own. If rooms can sweat, the little interior conference room did. The window fogging along its lower edge the way glass does when the people on this side pretend humility and the people on the other side practice it. Mara did not look at Ellen when the sentence ended, and the track continued, and you could hear, in the cheap mix poor fidelity, the sound of a thumb worrying the edge of a manila folder, and you could hear a breath that belonged to a person who had decided to ask forgiveness only after practicing how to pronounce it, and you could hear a door open that had no reason to be open, and a voice that belonged to the clerk and to the river and to the part of the precinct that has learned too much to be eligible for pension. You don't have to tell her. And the little click of a recorder stopped by a man who knew he had got enough to make his death untidy. By early evening, Ellen was no longer permitted to be merely a messenger. She was a statute in motion, and statutes in motion are required to appear before jurists with quiet shoes and cleaner consciences than the city can afford. Judge Cho watched the video of the platform twice without narrative, which is to say with the sound off and then on, and then she nodded in the particular way of women who spend their days being corrected by language and their nights correcting it back, and she said, "You will have your order, and if you insist, your complaint," which is the kind of generosity that sounds like a sentence, and is. When she left the annex, it had become the hour light thins into something you can cut. The river made its evening apology with the smell of iron that the wind performs best in months with an R in them. The city did not know it was participating in a ritual because cities are terrible parishioners, but cars idled at an unusual proportion. And in apartment windows, people who did not know the name Lozano divided dinners into 2 plates, and in a storage facility that had become studios anew. Resident wondered at the odd scorch on a patch of concrete, and decided not to ask. She walked, because returning to the room without earning it would be a discourtesy, and because the human body requires the unregistered arithmetic of steps, and as she climbed the municipal stairs that led to the lobby that led to the corridor that led to the door without handle, she realized that fear had become, for this hour at least, less of a predator and more of a clerk, necessary, brisk, not unkind, and when she pressed her palm to the seam, the room inhaled, as if the vent had been waiting for someone to provide the pretext. Chapter 9, Cross-Examination. The hour had stretched itself into the kind of late that buildings know better than people do. The clock received her without theatrics. The ledger lay open with the tolerant impatience of a docket that knows it will be finished tomorrow whether or not the cases deserve it. And the table had been rearranged as if by a janitor with a strong back and a stronger sense of right angles. The drives placed at the top edge like witnesses waiting in the hall. The chime arrived cool, and with it a new object that tried hard not to appear like a trick, a laminated service schedule for a subway line that had been retired before Maria lost her child to a decision. The sort of sheet station masters pin under thumbtacks and forget until a cleaner makes it her project. And at the bottom someone had written in ballpoint a circle around a time and a station name with vowels like a child's drawing. and looping away from the circle, an arrow that avoided being sentimental by accident, and a single initial that might have been a flourish or a refusal, J. The ledger had already pressed a heading into the paper, a kindness, because naming is half the labor. What will mercy do? And Elin Hart, who had sat through sentencing hearings where mercy degraded itself into a species of economy, wrote with a controlled hand that prevented the depression of the letters from tearing the paper. It will not confuse departure with betrayal. It will not make an altar of grief. It will insist that a mother be punished less than a clerk. It will place a dead man's voice where it is most likely to be believed. It will allow the city to be ashamed of the right thing for once. The room, incapable of nodding, produced instead a sound that the vent used when it permitted a change in weather. Something somewhere had opened, and in the corner that had previously learned to behave like a shelf, a narrow slot admitted a new file, an envelope not of manila, but of that greenish paper certain offices favored back when the city thought color would make tedium kind. And inside it a form Elin had filled out in 1999 with the seriousness of a student who knows the test has been designed to reveal what she loves. Request for Metroplastics footage, Station 14, stamped in red with the word denied not because of malice but because of habit, and attached with a staple that had bled rust, a letter from a supervisor she had outlived. We will not implicate the transit authority in a child's poor judgment, and her throat tightened because there are sentences that, once lodged in the architecture of a case, refuse to be evicted until someone brings a larger nail. She did not ask the room why it liked to rub her face in rejected requests, because the answer would only sharpen a knife she already used. She laid the denial beside the service schedule, and the chime offered a new object before she could pull breath, as if the room had been listening to her in elevators and had learned her weakest hours. And this time what slid into the world was a small box that had once been used to store gum or cufflinks and had been repurposed quickly by a man who resented the indignity. And inside it a token identical to the one she had placed on her tongue earlier, except for the faintest smear of a stamp. Along its rim, an E that had been married to a Y and refused to divorce. And beneath it in the bottom of the box a strip of paper on which Joel had written a joke he never had the chance to tell. If we keep filming the platform, maybe trains will learn to arrive on time, and she felt her mouth do the thing it does when crying has been postponed so long that the body thinks it has been forgotten and must be coaxed back with sarcasm. Proceed, the second chair said without sitting, and the room learned the rhythm of a courtroom without needing to import its furniture. The ledger, pressed with Exhibit A, platform video, accepted the name the way wind accepts snow, and the clock seemed to slow. The old trick of watches in rooms where stories are busy being born, and she testified, not into a camera and not under oath except the one you take alone, about the storage unit and the drives and the way the duffel's zipper had yielded too easily, about the chain of custody form left after the transfer that had been signed in a hand that had always enjoyed its own performance, about the man on the platform whose coat had never learned not to be the wrong coat, and about the child who had chosen a horizon not because it would accept her, but because it had not yet shown itself cruel. The room let her finish, which is the most any audience can do, and then it performed a small piece of prosecution on its own. From the felted seam where the reissue card had appeared came another rectangle, this one with curved corners and a date stamped over the space where a name would go. The day the tape had been requested, the day the denial had been stamped, and below in that strict clerkly hand that had filled the ledger's margins with miracles. Request sustained, late, admissible, unorthodox. And Elin, who had taught herself to distrust magic and to love paperwork, laughed in a way that made the vent briefly warmer. "You old bastard," she said to no one who would admit to being addressed, and the room, which was older than her career and possibly older than the city's current habit of disliking itself, permitted itself a low, almost human, exhale. It offered her, as if as a reward for believing in its jurisdiction only as much as was necessary, something like absolution, though it refused to name it. The shelf at the far wall developed a stack of mailers that might have been delivered by a courier and might have been copied by a ghost, each addressed not to a person but to a role. Clerk of court, criminal, assistant district attorney, special proceedings, detective bureau, property, Maria Lozano, resident, and in each a carbon copy of a document the city would pretend had always existed. Notice. Evidence returned. Notice. Review scheduled. Notice. Petition for reclassification. Missing 2 endangered. Notice. Right to be heard. And Elin, who had learned to deliver bad news with a grace that has nothing to do with softness, handled the envelopes as if they contained it. Animal requiring air. She expected, after the hour's legalisms, the room to indulge its own taste for the atmospheric, a lily card or a scrap of cloth, but instead it behaved like the better sort of cross-examiner, producing a question that could not be refused simply because it would be impolite to decline. Who do you spare? Pressed into the ledger's margins so lightly that she had to run a fingertip over the indentation to persuade the letters to show themselves in shadow. No one would have been theatrical and wrong. Myself. Honest and stupid. So she wrote what the room had been asking her to learn by doing. I spare the child a myth that punishes her. I spare the mother a confession the city would love too much. I do not spare the clerk. I do not spare the habit that called her theft a story and my error a procedure. I do not spare Joel because he did not ask to be spared. I do not spare the river its testimony. The second chair, which had practiced silence to a professional standard, moved a half-inch, as if someone had stood without meaning to and then thought better of it, and the chime arrived, and with it the air changed because somewhere in a corridor that belonged neither to the building nor to the river, but to the story, she had rejoined. A door had been opened that would allow a man whose name had been circled twice that afternoon to sign his name to a different kind of document, one with more witnesses and fewer flourishes. If the room had wished to participate in the arrest, for arrest is the grammar the city insists on before it agrees to add a chapter, it would have produced handcuffs or a radio, but it produced only something Elin had not allowed herself to imagine holding again, the sort of chain of custody label that used to be ordinary and had in recent years learned to be holy, pre-printed with received from Room 0, and a line for return to public, and she pressed the label across the Polaroid sleeve with the slow care of an officer who has refused to be rushed by grief, and she signed, and though no one else present could add their name without lying, the depression of the letters into the paper had the ridiculous comfort of ritual. She did not ask then if the room would let her out again to do the humiliating work of victory, because the seam had already gone polite as invitations, and the vent had already altered its temperature in sympathy with the day, and the clock had already decided to be fair, and she understood that the room had one more cross to lay on her file before it allowed her to leave. From the shelf slid a thin, soft package wrapped in cheap tissue, too light to matter, and therefore exactly what the room trusted, and inside lay a shoe that had been carried through storage and filings and perhaps even a river, canvas red faded to a diplomatic pink, sole lined with grit that had tried to become a map and failed, and threaded through one eyelet the shortest piece of string Elin had ever seen with a knot tied in the middle as if a child had practiced on a doll and then given the string to the city the way children give their drawings to refrigerators and to men in uniform. There was no tag because tags pretend they make objects behave. There was only the shoe and what it implied, and the ledger ready in case she wanted to founder on the temptation to call this closure. She didn't. Instead, she wrapped it again and placed it on the stack of mailers in the envelope marked for Maria, because horror requires many things from the living but not that. She will not press it into the woman's hands in a doorway under the camera of a reporter. She will leave it on a table and sit on a couch and allow time to behave, clumsy and unimaginative and kind. Then go, the room said in its only language, an alignment of vent and clock and seam and chime, and she took what she could carry and promised the remainder the indecent mercy of a chain properly reattached, and she found the municipal stair, which is to say the exit used by people who intend to come back. Outside, the annex had discovered night and had decided to hold it quietly. The reporter would be waiting and the judge would have signed, and the clerk would be rolling a cart of boxes down a forever hallway, and the river would be practicing being language, and the city, which had never once earned the word grateful, would behave like something deserving of better paperwork for an evening. And in her coat pocket the cut padlock had warmed the way metal does when your blood decides to give things the benefit of the doubt, and the key that had turned room 0 did not weigh more than before, but it felt, briefly, like a coin a child chooses to keep because the vending machine took her last one without pretending to vend. She would return, Not because the room demanded worship, but because rooms that enslave evidence will not free themselves. And when she does, the horror will not be the ghostly, operatic kind the city sells on walking tours, but the fatiguing, bureaucratic kind where judgment is a calendar and mercy is a form. Nevertheless, she will bring basil to a different building and ribbon to a different rail, and she will ring once for a dead partner and once for a mother, and she will learn to pronounce thank you without training the room to think it is God. Chapter 10. The Public Door. Morning made its small legal arguments on the annex windows and lost, as morning tends to in buildings that were bred for stamina rather than grace, and Elin, who had once believed that the only respectable endings arrived in courtrooms where microphones learned to be polite and stenographers saved souls by accident, discovered that the last act belonged neither to the court nor to the river, but to the narrow corridor between them where paper becomes movement, because after Mara had signed and the judge had initialed and June Park had chewed the cap of her pen like a woman who knows the alchemy between fact and print, a clerk with a cart had rolled 3 boxes into a room whose walls had never practiced shame and set the Polaroid and the drive and the sunflower-salted duffel on top as if to say, here is your story made heavier by obedience. And Elin had taken that weight like a woman who knows how to carry groceries and grief simultaneously and gone to find the man whose initials had been written in margins for too long without consequence. Riley did not attempt to be absent because men like Riley rarely believe architecture will turn on them. He arrived under his own steam, escorted by the sort of officer who has learned the art of looking like furniture until paper asks him to be a column. His hair had made an old man's compact with the comb, and his mouth retained the posture of a person about to steal a French fry, and when Elin entered the room, small, interior, meant for pretense rather than confession, he looked first for the camera and then for the microphone, and only after that at her, as if this were still a negotiation conducted in a currency that had worked for him once. Mara maintained her judicial impersonation at the edge of the table with the rested cruelty of a woman who has taken a nap in a chair and intends to sell the experience as strategy later, and Judge Cho had allowed herself to appear without robe and therefore carried more authority than she would have in uniform. The court reporter, a quiet miracle in a cardigan, sat with her machine like a man with a beloved dog who will not take advice. You don't have to tell me anything, Mara began, because the body needs ritual before it can be expected to allow blood to move through it in any coherent fashion, and Riley said, I've always wanted to hear what the inside of my own file sounds like, and Elin, who hates wit when it arrives with grease under its fingernails, put the drive on the table and pressed play, because sometimes grace has nothing to do with speech and everything to do with allowing a dead man to take up the space due him. Joel's voice entered the room again, and Riley, whose face had learned so many cheap versions of astonishment over the years, did not, to his credit, perform now. He listened with the blank courtesy of a man at a wake who intends to have an opinion but knows the hour discourages it, and he did not ask who had recovered the audio, because men like him believe in untraceable sources only when they belong to someone else. You moved property, Mara said when the last mechanical breath ended and the silence put its hands in its pockets, and Riley made the small shrug of a clerk explaining supply chains to a child and said, we all moved property, counselor, because in this city property moves to wherever the rent is paid by myth, and Elin, who had promised herself she would not slap the table out of a desire for percussion, put the Polaroid down instead, the little white frame acquiescing to the oak with the meekness of paper that knows it is about to be promoted to artifact, and she said, in the voice the room had taught her which contains neither apology nor triumph, you moved hours, which is to say you removed windows and replaced them with habits, and you moved witnesses, which is to say you preferred the company of your own narratives to the rudeness of other people's, and perhaps it was cruel to speak in a language he did not respect, but cruelty, properly scheduled, performs civic duty. They did not arrest him there, because endings that flatter the living rarely improve the dead. They served him a set of papers with the indecent civility the law reserves for people who've learned to make it look prissy, and Judge Cho scheduled something that would look like a reckoning and act like a calendar, and Riley, bless him, attempted one last time to retrieve the posture he had used when women were expected to apologize for knowing where the forms were kept, and said, you should have heard the way they spoke about you in property, Hart. the lady with the ledger, the bride of procedure, and Elin, who could have denied the slur or embraced the vow, did neither. She said, "I married a door," and left the room because sometimes the only negotiation the universe respects is the one where you refuse to let it see you choosing not to weep. Publicness, like any sacrament, requires a congregation. By noon, the annex had acquired one. Reporters who liked the word unsolved because it put wind in their sentences, family members who had come to take possession of time and had discovered that possession is 9/10 bureaucracy, a handful of officers who had seen Elin at her worst and preferred not to leave her to the liberals alone. And when June Park went live with a sentence, she had underlined the day before it landed with the satisfying thud of an object returned to gravity, evidence returned to the living, and Maria, who had spent years collecting denials as if they were postcards from a country that despised her, was brought to a small room and offered a chair and a table and a box and no cameras and no speeches. And Elin put the linen-wrapped package on the table and said, "There is something inside you do not have to see, ever, or today or tomorrow. No ceremony will be injured if you refuse. There is a card you may want to keep and a photograph you may want to burn and a right you may want to exercise or ignore. None of this changes the hour at which your kitchen grows quiet." And Maria, who had never asked for a holy woman and had been given one anyway by the precinct the day after the red sneaker, reached for the library card first, the laminate clinging to her skin the way old plastic does. And she said, without asking permission from her grief, she liked the river because the book told her to, and then, after a long time, "I will not look at the shoe today," and Elin took the wrapped weight back the way a midwife takes a child no one is asked to hold. And because the room had taught her to respect pledges made in negative space, she did not argue. The afternoon did the slow kind of justice. Orders were stamped by a hand that suffered no illusions about being God's proxy. An investigator placed a piece of paper marked iron camera into a folder that would embarrass the transit authority, and somewhere under an overpass, two men who had been boys in 1999 talked about how the platforms used to feel like stages rather than traps. Joel's widow received a call that did not use the words posthumous or vindication because those words are money and should be spent only when you intend to be poor afterward. In a small conference room, an IT tech made a backup of a drive and made a backup of the backup and then printed a label for both and affixed it with the care of someone feeding a nervous animal. And with each small industry, a weight shifted from the shelves of a room that had taught itself to hoard toward the file cabinets we train ourselves to believe are public. That night, when the building's corridors had learned to empty without consenting to darkness, Elin returned to the door without handle and presented the only credential that means anything to architecture, which is repetition. The seam recognized her palm, and the vent's breath adjusted to allow her particular lungs to think themselves original, and when she stepped into the chalk-pale space, the clock lifted its hand the way men salute when they are embarrassed by their own attention, and the ledger lay open at a page that had pressed itself with a heading so modest it qualified as indecent. "What will you keep?" And for the first time since she had woken here, she felt the instinct to lie, not for gain but for modesty. To say the honorable thing, "Nothing, take it all. Do with me what classrooms and precincts have already attempted," and she refused to co-sign her own self-importance. She wrote slowly, letting the letters sink until the paper looked like a riverbed. "I will keep the hours. I will keep my name. I will keep the right to be stupid in public. I will keep the faces of the living in a place where the dead cannot perform ownership. I will not keep the key." Room 0 obeyed the sentence, as if it had been law all along. From the slot where the reissue card had come there slid, humble as a prayer card and heavy as a verdict, a small envelope addressed to no one. Public door/custodian. Any, and inside it the key lay wrapped in that same judicial felt, its warded teeth glinting with the vulgar satisfaction of a tool that has been used properly. And the ledger pressed a second heading without asking permission. "Who will you name?" And Elin thought about people who liked their names in newspapers, and people who had hidden their names in closets, and people who had never been asked whether their names wanted to learn to behave as nouns. And she wrote the smallest, plainest noun she had, "Clerk," because the city is saved, when it is saved, by people who submit forms accurately and despise drama, and the seam warmed. And she understood that the room had accepted the principle that after today anyone with the patience to stand still long enough to Learn a new breath could be the person who turned the key. Testify, the second chair said, for the last time, and because she knew that horror lives where testimony refuses to be bored, she gave the room what bored at least, which was her own voice admitting the small corruptions that had qualified as survival. The jokes told in property rooms to dull the teeth of other men's appetites. The mornings she had chosen surveillance over door knocking because watching is cleaner. The days she had prayed for an answer that did not exist because the mother looked like a woman who had been promised a country and handed a permit, and when she was finished, she signed her name where the ledger had insisted. The depression of the signature deep enough to become relief when light touched it from the side, and the clock chimed only once, but with an overtone that sounded like a building allowing itself to be proud. She left the key in the envelope marked public door on the desk of a woman named Bennett, who had worked the night window of the annex for 23 years and had never once failed to notice when a person needed a form more than they needed advice. She said, "If anyone asks to see a room that looks like it was designed by a person who mistrusts theater, tell them they can keep the hours, but not the key. If anyone asks to return something that doesn't belong to them, teach them how to sign their name without tears." And Bennett, who recognized faith when it arrived in unflattering shoes, nodded as if presented with a deed and slid the envelope into a drawer next to rubber bands and a stapler that could have killed vermin. Outside, the river had achieved the peculiar clarity it gets on nights when shame has been honestly spent. The city refrained from congratulating itself because it doesn't know how. June Park filed a story that used the word custody 4 times and never once meant children. Maria slept for 3 contiguous hours for the first time in 26 years. Riley stared at the ceiling and discovered it knew his name. In a basement that believed in its own importance, a box was moved from cold to active and then to public, and the shelf, sensing its loss like a body missing a tooth, adjusted its balance and refused to squeal. Back in the chalk-bright room, in the ledger, under "What will you keep?" a hand not hers pressed a final line. So faint you had to look from the side to see it. The window is a lie. The door is a memory. The witness is alive, and the clock, satisfied with its accounting, let the hour end. Epilogue, After Hours. In the months that followed, the city practiced a modest virtue, and if it wasn't holiness, no one with any sense complained. Maria Lozano began to bring her coffee mug to the branch library again because the habit of chairs that are too small and books that lie about rivers is a form of oxygen. And once, standing at the children's table while a volunteer who had not been born in 1999 read a picture book about submarines, she felt her breath break on an old reef and then continue, ungainly and valuable, and there are graces that do not require anyone's permission. The Polaroid lived for a while in a file at the annex, and then, when it had finished its duty as an instrument of jurisdiction, was placed in a clear sleeve and loaned to a small exhibit on the first floor where the sign read "Evidence, returned to the living," and people looked at it with the rudeness of the uninjured, and then with the patience of citizens, and sometimes a child said, "She is one shoe," and sometimes a grandmother said, "We will wear the other until it knows what to do." Judge Cho was reelected without pretense and used the political credit to sign 3 unglamorous orders that changed the way property rooms labeled late-found things. Mara Klein made her reputation not on a televised trial, but on a dull symposium where she explained chain of custody as if it were a miracle you could perform with rubber stamps and resolve. June Park wrote a long piece in which the villain was not a person but a habit, and half the comments were furious in the profitable way. Truth always provokes. Riley pled to a set of verbs that amounted to a biography and learned that mercy is available even to men who have taught themselves to refer to rooms as closets. He served something that did not equal a life and did equal a sentence. And on his second day inside, he taught a teenager how to fill out a request form legibly and was brought to tears by the stupid salvation of carbon paper. Joel's widow, given a copy of the recording with a kindness that could not be named, played it once and then placed it under a ceramic dish because there are protections that are older than evidence. Ellen kept working because some people are only alive when the day expects them. She took on easy burglaries because easy burglaries are impossible, and she said no to cameras as if refusal were a sacrament. And once a week, she walked down to the river with a paper bag of sunflower seeds and gave them to gulls that had learned to impersonate witnesses and to carp that sucked them with the ferocity of a proselyte. And she would have laughed at the metaphor if she had not been busy breathing. She left the red shoe where it could not be made a relic or a prop, in a locker in a shelter whose staff knew how to keep objects from becoming morality, and the only person who saw it again was a girl who had decided, temporarily, to take the bus to a different horizon. The girl laced it to a string and wore it as a pendant for a week and then returned it without speaking because not all rites require an officiant. The room without windows did not vanish because institutions do not believe in exorcism. It altered its schedule. Once, at 2 a.m, Elin woke to the sensation of a page being pressed but did not get up, and the next day at the annex, Bennett nodded toward her drawer and said, "Someone came and asked without using the right words, so I gave them the envelope and told them to practice humility before they returned it. They cried and then stopped. I think we did fine." And Elin, who had never been given a better progress report, left a plant on the counter with a tag that said, "Water when underlined," and drew a small line with her thumbnail through the paper every time she saw Bennett yawn. On certain Sundays, in a courtroom that had learned to lower its lights for mercy without becoming sentimental, a bailiff rang a bell once as he unlocked the doors, and civilians, brought by curiosity rather than summons, took seats and were made complicit in the small miracle that is a calendar working in public. On certain Thursdays, the chain of custody clerk sent out notices with return TO. Public typed clean as him, and in the precinct where Elin kept her jacket on a chair she refused to call hers, a young detective with a laugh like a stapler found a photocopy on her desk that read, in letters pressed into the paper by a machine that did not care about it, what was kept / what was traded / what was returned, and she filled in none of the blanks and all of them, which is to say she did her job. Sometimes, walking past the annex as the sun made a lyre out of slate, Elin would feel the chime move under her breastbone the way a well-tuned watch reminds a wrist that time is both tyranny and favor, and she would put her hand there without embarrassment and count, not blessings and not sins, just minutes, because the body prefers arithmetic to myth, and she would think of the first words she had read in the chalk pale light. The window is a lie, the door is a memory, and she would supply the ending the room had been too proud to write, the testimony is ours, and then she would go inside and sign for a box and hold the door for a mother and argue with a clerk and decide what mercy will do, because horror has a bureaucracy, and she had finally learned to work in it without making herself the point. In the ledger that lived wherever rooms go when they are not performing, a page closed. The depression of her name remained. The heading at the top of the next leaf had already been pressed by some other hand, faint as the promise of daylight. A new witness wakes. The clock ticked. The vent breathed. The door waited, not a window and no longer a lie.